Okay, so now we're going to go on to Section 3, Chapter 15 homework. So we'll go into the Cengage, and I'm in there already, and then click on Section 3. We'll scroll down to Chapter 15, and then we'll scroll down to our homework again. Remember, the one we always do is the one that says Counts Towards Grades, and we'll click that on. And in Chapter 15, there are two problems, but they do take a little bit of time because each one has multiple components to it. So briefly, before we take a look at the questions, I want to just go over a couple reminders. So as you're doing these, especially question 1, you'll want to be thinking about consumer and producer surplus. So quick reminder in front of you on the screen is a supply curve and a demand curve. And remember, the consumer surplus is the area or the benefits gained from the market, and the producer surplus is the area that the producer gains from the market. And consumer surplus is defined as what people are willing to pay, which is always represented by their demand curve, and what they actually pay. What they're willing to pay, what they actually pay, which is the market price. So the consumer surplus is this triangle, as it's labeled, and producer surplus is the difference between what firms will sell it for and what they actually receive, what they sell it for, what they actually receive. So it would be in a normal supply and demand market, this is what the producer surplus would look like. I'm going to scroll on down and look at what happens in a monopoly market, and specifically in this case what we have is we're assuming in this particular picture, and it's also what's assumed in the homework, that the marginal cost curve faced by the monopoly is constant, meaning it doesn't change. So remember, marginal cost is the supply curve for a firm, because supply curve, reminder, it tells us what they're willing to sell their product for at different quantities. So their marginal cost curve is representing their supply curve. It's one and the same thing. In this case, because the because the marginal cost does not change, their supply curve or marginal cost curve is this straight horizontal line. It's a constant, won't change. So in the picture of monopoly, it looks a little confusing at first, because monopoly, their demand curve and their marginal revenue curves, remember from our lectures, are two different lines. Because monopolies, in order to sell more, have to drop the price on all units. So that means their extra revenue they make from every additional unit sold goes down. So their demand and marginal revenue curves, if they're non-discriminating, won't be the same. So in this picture, this is a non-discriminating monopoly. So this non-discriminating monopoly is going to charge everybody the same price. So as we've done in all our examples we've been doing in class, we always want to find the place at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that will always determine the profit maximizing level of output. And then from there, each firm, in this case it's a monopoly, so it's one firm, will price accordingly. And the price accordingly will always be what people are willing to pay, which is represented by your demand curve. So with that in mind, we're going to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is that point right there. So it's this line right here, and then we're going to go all the way up to the demand curve and come across, and that's what the monopoly is going to go ahead and charge. So in this picture, the consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve, what the consumer is willing to pay, and what they actually pay, which is this monopoly price, so it's this triangle. And the producer surplus is going to be the area that represents the difference between what the firm would be willing to sell it for, which is represented by the supply curve, which in this case is the same as the marginal cost curve being constant, and what they would actually receive, which is the monopoly price. So it would be this box right here, that blue box. That would be the producer surplus. And then this little triangle here represents the deadweight loss. because from a monopoly standpoint, we would actually want to continue producing, and the consumer would, because the demand curve, the benefit to the consumer is up here and the cost to the firm is down here. The benefit to the consumer is here, the cost is here. So this whole area here is what we call our deadweight loss. And just quickly, just to kind of use the same picture, the monopoly picture, we're going to quickly look at the areas of producer and consumer surplus using a monopoly picture, but in perfect competition. So if this picture were representing perfect competition, the demand curve that would be facing the perfectly competitive firm, it's a little abstract, but your demand curve would be the exact same thing as the marginal revenue in perfect competition. So in perfect competition, we would go to where marginal revenue, which would be this demand curve, because it would be the marginal revenue curve as well, equals your marginal cost. That would be that point right there. And so the quantity, this QC would be the quantity that the perfectly competitive firms would be putting out, and this would be the price being charged right here. And so notice that the consumer surplus area, if this were perfect competition, would be everything below the demand curve and above the price charge. So it would be this entire, all three of those areas, the green, the blue, and the gray, that would all go to the consumer, and nothing would go to the producer. There would be no producer surplus. It, in this case, is all consumer surplus being reaped. And just pointing out, the reason that in this particular situation there is no producer surplus is because we have assumed that in this picture the marginal cost curve is constant, doesn't change. But in this situation, with the constant, there will be no producer surplus. So keep that in mind as we move on to the first part of the question in this chapter. So with all of this in mind, I know it's a lot, we're going to go on and look at the question. So question number 1. Pull it up. So here we go. So you're told that this is a small town. They're served by many competing supermarkets which have all the same costs, which have all the same constant marginal costs. So this picture right here is actually competition. So keep that in mind in this picture. So this is a competitive industry. So in this picture, we're going to find, this is the demand curve, this is the marginal cost curve in the competitive industry. And you are now asked in this picture to go ahead and represent what's the consumer surplus, what's the producer surplus in this picture. And I'm just going to caution you here. This is, again, perfect competition type of idea here. The consumer surplus is everything above the price line and below the demand. And remember, in perfect competition, the price that's charged matches where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. The producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price charged in the market and the cost to the firm, or what the firm would be willing to sell it at. And what you want to kind of keep in mind here is this price line, or this marginal cost curve, is actually the price line. So be careful when you're answering that one. Now this picture is representing a monopoly. So they're telling you that all these little independent markets, supermarkets, have combined into one chain. So it's kind of like that article that we have on our Facebook regarding the International Monetary Fund being concerned with these mega corporations. So this would be a good example of that, where all these little ones, little chains come together and they just form one big chain. So they become a monopoly. And so now what we have is a downward sloping demand curve, and a marginal revenue curve, which isn't going to be the same as the demand curve as in the above picture, because monopolies, again, in order to sell more, they have to keep dropping the price on all units. They're non-discriminating, so the extra revenue from more units sold continues to drop. So these two lines are different. So monopolies are just like perfectly competitive firms, though, that they're going to decide to produce when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then they'll price accordingly. So what you'll want to do is refer back to the review part of this where we started on this question to figure out where your consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then the deadweight loss would be represented in this picture. I think you should be able to do that. Okay, question number 2. What I'm going to do with question number 2 is we're going to go over to a Word document that I put together to kind of help you with this particular problem. So you're told at the get-go, you're given these 3 pieces of information. So what this problem is doing is it's actually looking at the mathematical way we could calculate prices and quantity demanded at different levels and marginal revenue actually using the math. So let's take a look at what that means. So this is question 2, and I've just put it into other terms here. I'm making it look a little different, but you're told your demand is equal to the price, and it's equal to 100 minus Q. Then you're told what your marginal revenue is, and then you're told what your marginal cost is. So you're asked to plot the demand curve in that first part of the question. So in order to do that, you've got to get the points. So what a good rule of thumb to do when you're trying to figure out things are to do extremes. I've done 3 examples. So we could do, for example, at Q over 0, what would price be? So all we would do is we would take our formula. So the demand curve is P equals 100 minus Q. So we just plug in 0 for Q. And we would find when Q is 0, our price is 100. If we then wanted to use the number 10, we plug that into the formula. And that would be price is 100 minus 10. So we would now know when the price is 90, our quantity demanded is 10. And then our last one, extreme, this is another extreme. If Q is 100, we would end up with the price being 0. So we would know that a price of 0, the quantity demanded would be 100. And so that then allows you to take this information and plot it. Then you're asked to determine the profit maximizing quantity and price. So it's just like what we've been doing the whole time. You find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Only this time, rather than using the diagrams and finding the point, we're actually given the formulas. So we can take our marginal revenue formula and our marginal cost formula and just set them equal to each other. And then we're going to want to solve for the in this case, it'll be our Q. So to solve for the Q, we have to get everything on the one side where Q is. So this is just a quick overview of what we've done. So mathematically, whenever you have an equal sign between things, remember whatever you do to the left, you must do to the right side, or vice versa. Whatever you do to the right side, you better be doing to the left side to maintain the equal of these two. So if we go through and get everything to the Q, we find Q equals 30. So this is telling us that the profit maximizing quantity, or where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, is at a Q of 30. So then if we want to know what price is represented at Q of 30, we go back to our demand curve, which we have, and just plug in the quantity, and you'll get the answer. Then you have a couple last questions on this, where you're told the price ceiling, there's a price ceiling being imposed. Now remember, price ceilings aren't always problems. So just remember that as you're doing this question. So you're told that the price ceiling that's going to be imposed is going to be 10% below the monopoly price. of $70 that we just calculated. So mathematically, in order to figure out what the new price would be, it's just a mathematical trick that you do. It's 10% less than 70. So mathematically, what you do is you take your $70 and you're going to times it by 1 minus the 10%, or $70 times 0.90, or in essence, the new price is 90% of the old $70, which would be $63. And then you're asked, what would the quantity be? So just as before, we know what the price is, so we'll still use our demand curve, only now this time we're going to plug in the quantity, which is we're going to plug in the price, which we know is 63, and solve for our Q. Last part of this question is kind of the same thing, but this time you're told the monopoly price ceiling is going to be set at 50% below what was just calculated, and it's going back to the original $70. So you'll do the same thing to figure out what the new price will be. It's 50% less than the 70, so mathematically the trick is you take the old price and times it by 1 minus the 50%, or 1 minus 0.5, which means 70 times 0.50. So the new price is 50% of the $70, the original. So our new price is 35, and to figure out what that quantity would be, you'll just plug that new price into our demand curve formula. And in both this question, or this part of the question, and the one previous up here at the 10%, you're asked whether or not, and this is going to cause a shortage. And I'm just going to caution you to be very careful that you take a look at the demand curve when you're answering those questions. I think you'll be able to do it, and that should be